Good afternoon and welcome to today's QRM webinar, The Beat Goes On, the Other MDS Changes. We are thrilled to have you all here today, joining us from all over the country. My name is Amy Gerlach and I'll be your moderator for this session. Before we get started, I always like to go over a few housekeeping items just to ensure that we all have a seamless experience throughout the webinar. So this webinar is being recorded and you will receive an email with the link to the QRM Health website. This is where you'll be able to access the recording and all the amazing resources that our presenters have gathered for you today. So be on the lookout for that. It typically arrives within 24 hours. Secondly, the handouts for this presentation are available at the link in the chat bar, the chat feature in the control bar. So if you'd like to follow along and make notes, you can certainly do that. We also encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. So you can do that by clicking on the Q&A icon in the control panel, or rather that toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom. And then following the webinar, if we have an abundance of questions, then we'll curate a Q&A document that we'll release when we send out that email, and we'll upload it also to the resource page with the recording. So that's pretty much it. I will now pass it off to Mark Heider, who is our VP of Reimbursement Strategy and Education for QRM. Mark oversees our Department of Clinical Reimbursement, and he'll be introducing today's presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I'm very excited today to introduce Megan Usry and Stacy Grondell, QRM's two directors of clinical reimbursement. Both are very skilled RNs and have a wealth of knowledge to share. And as we move through this season of change, the CMS changes, really happy with the information they have to provide, which really simplifies some of these changes and puts it into a better format to digest and move on. And what we hope is that you find it helpful and figure out the steps that you and your teams need to take as you approach October 1st. We also hope that you'll listen at the end when we talk about some of our upcoming events which will increase your knowledge, will give you additional information for those changes that are coming up on October 1st, like I said. So really excited, and hope you enjoy this presentation. Give us feedback and ask questions, which we will respond to. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you ladies.
Great, thank you. We're going to go ahead and turn our video off just because we know sometimes that can be a little distracting. So, and we're both hand talkers. So we're going to turn our video off and we will go ahead and get started. So today, really, our focus is introducing you to all of these changes that are coming to our MDS item set. And like Mark said, we have additional webinars that we will be doing in August that will dive a lot deeper and really talk about strategies in your facilities. How can we make this work? How can we make it work so that it's not a huge burden on our facilities? So for today, we're going to talk about the global changes to the MDS item set. We're going to define the self-report items. If you've had any opportunities to look at the changes that are coming, there are a lot more self-report items. And so we're going to talk about those and what those mean. We're going to talk about notable new and revised items section by section. And then we're going to point out those new look back periods that you will see throughout the new MDS item set. Like I said, we have additional webinars that we'll be doing in August that will really help us figure out how to make this work in our facilities. So real quickly, just the global changes. The REI manual still is in draft, so I want to make sure that you guys are aware of that. There's still the opportunity for adjustments to be made. I know there are several people that have made comments and suggestions to things to be corrected before they make that final version. The revised wording has happened to include gender neutral language throughout. There have been minor wording updates to add clarification. These will be highlighted in red when you look up or download that new REI manual. There have been coding examples that have been added to enhance, and they added new examples for clarity, which is always nice. questions have been added throughout about information source. So we can tell that that's going to be a huge focus for CMS. Where are we getting this information? Is it documented in the chart so that we can support that? So the standard look back period for the MDS 3.0 is 7 days unless otherwise stated. And the look back period does not typically extend into pre-admission unless that the instructions for that item state otherwise. So we're used to seeing that typical 7-day look back period. We know that they've added a few additional look back periods over the years, but now we have our 3-day, our 5-day, 7-day, 14-day, 30-day, 60-day look back timeframes that we have to pay attention to. So that's something I want people to start thinking about. We want people to start thinking about, okay, what are these different timeframes? Is that going to impact our process in our facility? There is an increase in resident voice, and that really does allow us to get better information. And so CMS has added a lot of items that add that resident voice. They want to hear from the resident. Most of the resident interview questions, they do allow you to ask a family or significant other, a guardian, or a representative if they're unable to respond. But if they refuse to respond, we can't use any other resources. So that's really important to note. I put it down there again on the slide to just really emphasize that. If the resident refused to respond, we simply code that and move on. We cannot gather the information from anywhere else. Okay. If they're unable to respond, that's when we can go and find the information in other sources. I do want to point out all throughout the REI manual, you have a symbol that looks like this on your screen. This indicates that it is a resident interview question, or they want to hear the resident voice. So we did add those throughout our presentation so that you're aware of what needs to be asked of the resident. I do want to focus on these two items, B1300 and B700, which is your health literacy, as well as your isolation, your social isolation. Both of these items are very strict in saying that it is intended to be a resident self-report item and no other sources can be used, including family members or caregivers. So these two questions, if the information doesn't come from the resident, you can't get it from any other source. Now we're going to focus on section A and look at the changes. There were quite a few changes in section A. One of them being they removed the option for the optional state assessment. Some of you are probably thinking, well, my state's going to make us do the OSA on October 1 for case mix purposes. And the OSA has a standalone item set that states can choose to use. If you are unsure if your state is going to use an OSA, you can always reach out to your state REI coordinator and you can find their contact information in Appendix B. You could also find them by doing a simple Google search as well, or calling your state office. QRM is also working very hard on gathering all this information for you as well. So in section A, right now what we're currently using, you have your ethnicity and your race are combined in one question. What it does in the new item set is it divides them up and it changes it just a little bit. So we separated our race and our ethnicity, and it gives them the opportunity to check all that apply or pick more than one option. So if they say, yes, I'm this, and yes, I'm this, and yes, I'm this, we code all of those on the MDS. This has the scenario we already talked about. If they're unable to respond, then we are going to code it as an X, and then we can follow the REI instructions to get the information from other sources. If they refuse to respond, we code it as a Y, and we cannot get the information from any other source. So this is something to really think about in your facility. Where are you getting this information now? I would say most facilities, they're getting it off of hospital paperwork or from the admissions papers or other places like that. We are not asking the resident. So that's something that you really want to think about. This is a resident response question now. So we're asking them the question. So we have race, which is the same scenario. Again, we're asking them, what is your race? And we're allowing them to pick all that apply for them. So they could have several things coded on this. For the race, it's the same that with the ethnicity. If they are unable to respond, we code it as an X, and then we're able to go and use those other sources. If they refuse to respond, we code it as a Y, and we can't use any other source to gather that information. The next question we're going to look at is transportation. So transportation could cause a huge barrier for that resident when they're leaving your facility, or what has happened to them prior, because they don't have transportation to the places that they need to go. So this is one thing that I thought was really interesting. It doesn't have the exact questions you answer on the MDS form, which is the picture that you see up on your screen. However, when you read in the REI manual, it has in quotations the exact questions that you're supposed to answer. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. So you ask those questions, and again, this is a check all that applies. So the resident can pick, they can say, yes, they've kept me from medical appointments, and yes, they've kept me from non-medical things, okay? These are the two questions that are listed in the REI manual. This is under the steps for assessment. It says, in the past 6 months to a year, has lack of transportation kept you from medical appointments or from getting your medications? And we ask, in the past 6 months to a year, has a lack of transportation kept you from non-medical meetings, appointments, work, or from getting things that you need? So it's important that you're not just looking at the MDS form and expecting all of the new information to be there. I cannot stress it enough how important it is that you actually go in and read the REI manual. You understand what the directions are saying. You look at those new definitions that may be in there, the steps for assessment. Like we mentioned, they've added a lot of examples. Make sure that you're going in and you're looking at those examples, and you're utilizing the tools that are put out there for you. The next item is entered from. They added some additional options. With this, I would say make sure that you understand the definitions of these items. This often is miscoded, especially when we're looking at hospice versus home and community. So make sure you understand those definitions, and they are in the REI manual. Then we have our discharge status. This is similar to the admissions that we just looked at. It added a few more options. And what it also does is it makes that for our PPS discharge assessments, this is now a gateway question. So if you choose items 2 through 12, and you're working on your PPS discharge, it's going to open up additional question. One thing I want to point out, this is going to impact your SNF QRP. This goes into that calculation. So being aware of that, making sure that you're coding where they're actually discharging to. So if on the PPS discharge assessment, you check the boxes 2 through 12, then it's going to ask you the question, did you provide a current reconciled medication list to the subsequent provider? Because those options through 2 through 12 were telling us that this resident was going to another provider. They weren't going home and they didn't pass away. So we simply choose a yes or no. And then it's going to ask us, how did you provide that information? How did you provide that reconciled medication list? Did you do it through electronic health record? Did you do it verbally? Did you do another method by emailing or putting it on a CD? I don't know who uses CDs anymore, but just in case you put it on a CD, you have that option as well. Okay. If you choose options 1 or 99, which means they went to home and community, or not listed, then it's going to ask you, did you provide that reconciled medication list to the resident at discharge? Again, you're simply going to answer yes or no. If you say yes, then how did you provide that? So with these two items, something that we really need to look at and see how our process is going. How are we going to prove that we did it? How is that happening in your facility? Are you doing this already in your facility? If you're not, how are you going to get started doing it? And how are you going to prove that you did it in that medical record? Again, we're going to be discussing a lot of these strategies in our webinars in August. So make sure that you join those so that we can have a more robust conversation about what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And we'll discuss those strategies.
All right, so we're going to move into section B. So there is a new question regarding health literacy in section B. It's item B 1300. And this is going to be used to determine whether or not the patient needs someone to assist them in reading instructions, pamphlets, or other written material from their doctor or from their pharmacy. The question, as Stacy mentioned earlier, this is one of those two questions that absolutely have to be self-reported. So we can't use any other source documentation to answer this question. So this item should be asked of the patient as is and answered appropriately. If the patient is unable to respond, you would code this item as 8. And if the patient declines to respond, you would code this item as 7. All right, moving on to section D, we have a couple of changes here. So the PHQ-9 is changing to a PHQ-2 to 9. And this interview is also being added to the Part A PPS discharge assessment. So some key takeaways here are really noted in the coding instructions. If a resident cannot communicate, then the staff interview should be conducted unless the assessment is being completed as a standalone PPS discharge. And in that case, you would skip the interview and go to the social isolation question. If the 2 initial questions in column 1 are coded as a 9, which is no response, or both are coded as a 0 or 1 in column 2, then the PHQ 2 to 9 interview ends right there. It is important to note, though, that while the interview, for the MDS purposes would end, it's still pretty important to gather some of that information from the patient. We would still want to know if the patient has a poor appetite or if they have thoughts of harming themselves. So even if the answer to those first 2 questions is no, or no, really, we still should be gathering some of that information, even though for MDS purposes, the interview ends. So what does this mean? This is an example of when a PHQ 2 to 9 interview would end. So that first column is coded a 9 for the first 2 questions. The second column would be blank, and the total severity score would also be blank. Looking at kind of that second caveat to that PHQ interview, if both D0150A2 and D0150B2 are coded 0 or 1, the interview would also end. And so the next slide shows what that would look like in the MDS. So the first column might be answered as yes, but if the second column is coded as 0, which is never or 1 day, or 1, which is 2 to 6 days, the interview again would end, and then that total severity score would be added from column 2 and entered in. All right, so if the interview doesn't meet the criteria mentioned on the previous couple of slides, the interview progresses and the rest of the questions are asked and answered just as we normally do with the PHQ-9. All those questions are the same. We do have another new item in section D that will be included in the MDS beginning October 1. So we're now going to be asking about social isolation. The question reads, how often do you feel lonely or isolated from those around you? And same as that health literacy question, and as Stacy mentioned on those first couple of slides, this item has to be a resident self-report. So no other sources should be used to identify the response here. And the draft RAI manual, just as a note, the draft RAI defines social isolation as actual or perceived lack of contact with other people, such as living alone or residing in a remote area. All right, section GG, just kidding. We're not going to cover section GG. We have already done a couple of webinars on section GG. If you were not able to attend those, or if you want to re-listen to those, you can go to our website, qrmhealth.com, and then just navigate to the events page, and you'll find the links to those recordings.
It says view old events or something, and then you can see the old ones, and you can also see our upcoming. So that's the same place where you can register for any upcoming that we have.
Yep. All right, so we're going to move on to section J. In section J, we've revised, or we're seeing revised wording for the pain and its effect on sleep question. So the current wording asks, over the past 5 days, has pain made it hard for you to sleep at night? And in the draft RAI and in the final item set, we're now asking over the past 5 days, how much of the time has pain made it hard for you to sleep at night? So just some change in the wording there. And the response options to this interview question were expanded. So rather than a yes or a no, we're looking for one of these listed options, rarely or not at all, occasionally, frequently, almost constantly, or you would code an 8 if the patient was unable to answer. All right, moving a little further into section J, we have a change with pain as it impacts day-to-day activities. The question currently just asked, have you limited your day-to-day activities because of pain? And in the new item set, we have a revision to that question. So now we're asking if the patient has limited day-to-day activities, excluding rehab and therapy sessions. So, and then again, also, rather than the current answer for yes or no, we have those expanded options. So rarely, not at all, occasionally, frequently, almost constantly, or unable to answer. And then next we have the new question at item J0520, asking how often the patient has limited their participation in therapy sessions because of pain. So that previous question excludes the therapy sessions. This new question asks specifically about rehab and therapy sessions. So if the important thing to know here is if the patient's not on therapy services in those last 5 days, the answer would be 0, does not apply. All right, so to refresh a little bit here, so there's still a 5-day look back period for the pain interview. That is not changing, but there is a big change in the response options for some items. So now we have the responses in reverse order. You know, we currently use what's on the left, so those old response options, and then you'll see on the right side where it says new, they are in inverse order. The only caveat to that is unable to answer would still be coded as a 9. All right, we're going to move into section K. So in section K, we have some additional columns and additional look back periods to answer for K0520. Currently, we're just answering, while a resident or while not a resident. And in the new item set, we've got on admission, while not a resident, while a resident, and at discharge. Important takeaway here is that on admission, the assessment period is days 1 through 3 of the SNF PPS stay. And at discharge, the assessment period is the last 3 days of the SNF PPS stay, ending with that date that's listed at A2400C. So you'll only be answering on admission and at discharge for PPS assessments. The 2 middle columns, while a resident, while not a resident, remain the same with that 7-day look back period. No changes there. And looking a continued look at nutritional approaches and their impact on PDPM payment for Med A patients, that is not changing. So only the 2 middle columns will drive payment under PDPM. On admission and at discharge, while we are coding them on the PPS assessments, at this point will not drive payment. All right, we got an updated example for item K0520 as well. And Stacy was talking on those first couple of slides about the things that we got in the draft RAI manual that were really awesome. All of that red documentation in there, giving us new examples and new coding instructions. And this was a really good one. So I'm not going to read this one word for word, but essentially it clarifies when parenteral and IV feeding can be coded in addition to coding IV meds. And it really cites just the volume of the diluent for IV medication reconstitution. And that's kind of that deciding factor. So the physician in the example ordered an additional volume of diluent than what that IV med required for reconstitution. And it was specifically to address hydration needs. So in this example, both parenteral and IV feeding and IV medications would be coded.
And I really want to emphasize it's the hydration, because if he had just ordered additional fluids when diluting the antibiotic, then you have to really think, can I really code this? Because the instructions specifically say that the documentation has to support that was received for hydration or nutrition. So that's another thing that you really want to pay attention to. It's what this example is showing is not just because it had extra fluids when it was diluting the antibiotic, but why were those fluids? Why was that extra fluids given? All right, now we'll move on to section M. There weren't really any huge changes in section M, but I did want to point out that they did say in the REI manual that the Kennedy terminal ulcers are not primarily caused by pressure and are not coded in section M. If any of you have been in your MDS positions for long, you know that's like a career long debate that has always occurred throughout my entire career. People saying, yes, you should, people saying, no, you shouldn't. So now it's in there in black and white. No, they are not coded in your section M. And then if a resident had a pressure ulcer or injury that was documented on admission, then closed, that then reopens at that same stage, it is coded as present on admission. And now moving on to section N. Section N, most of you are aware, is where we document our medications and the things that are happening with those medications. And N0415 is where we are coding our high-risk drug classes. So it used to just be called medications received, and now it's your high-risk drug classes. As you can see in the old one on the left, and then you have the new one on the right. And we'll talk a little bit more about our new one here. So we've added our antiplatelet and our hypoglycemic. So those are new categories that were added. If you look at what we're using now, or what I call the old one, that asks us for the number of days during that look back period that they received that certain drug classification. Now we're just saying, did they take it during that 7-day look back period? Did they have it at all during that 7-day look back period? If they did, you're going to check it. Before, after you put the number of days that they had it, you were done and you could move on. With the new item set, we now, if we say, yes, they were taking this, we now have to go and say, why were they taking this? Is the indication noted? Okay, so the MDS isn't saying you don't have to write why it was there. You're looking for that. Is there an indication for use? So again, documentation is key. And I stress this so often. If it wasn't documented in the chart, you cannot code it on the MDS. It has to be documented in the chart, with the exception of your direct resident interview items, so like your BIMs. But all other items have to be supported by documentation in the chart. This slide just kind of talks about those things, just reiterates it. It's extremely important that you understand that you have to be looking for that indication for use. That has to be there. That's asking a question, right? We want to be able to fill out our MDSs accurately and appropriately, and so we need to be looking for that. Remember that your pharmacological classifications and coding medications by those pharmacological classifications has not changed. That's still the instructions. We're not coding them based on use. We're coding them based on what classification they fall under. Now we'll move on to section O. With section O, you have O100. This is what most of you are typical used to seeing. You have your 2 columns, while not a resident, while a resident. It's a 14-day look back period. So this is an item that does go into that pre-admission time frame, as long as it's within that 14-day period. So they have updated it now, and they now have 3 columns. You have on admission, while a resident, and at discharge. So admission means the admission period is the days 1 through 3 of that SNF PPS. So like Megan was talking about in section K, when we're talking about that first column, it's only talking about SNF PPS stays, okay? And it's the first 3 days. You have while a resident, so that's any of these that were performed while a resident of the facility and within the last 14 days. And then that final column is at discharge. So the assessment period is the last 3 days of that PPS day, and it ends at A2400C. So whatever day you put in A2400C, that's the last day of that look back period. And then we move on to kind of take a deeper dive into these, because I think it's important to see how they're broken up. It's not the same options that we had before. So we're looking at cancer treatments, and for chemotherapy, we're looking, did they have it IV? Did they have it orally? Or was it through a different route? I want to point out too, on this side, we added those look back periods in red again, just so that you can get that clear in your head. The on admission means the first 3 days of the PPS stay. On discharge, that means the last 3 days of the PPS stay. And while a resident is that 14-day period. Okay, so we've got those varying look back periods for this item. Then for our oxygen therapy, are we giving it continuous? Are we giving it intermittently? Is it a high concentration? For sectioning, is it scheduled or is it as needed? For our non-invasive BiPAP, for our non-invasive mechanical ventilation, is it a BiPAP or a CPAP? So again, it's wanting more details. It's wanting to know specifically what's going on with this resident while they're in your facility. We get to IV medications. It's not simply an IV medication. It's what type. Did they have vasoactive? Did they have antibiotics? Did they have anticoagulants? Or is it another kind? You will see all those darker gray areas. So there are certain items that if it's your admission column, you're not going to answer those. So for your hospice care and your isolation or quarantine, we don't have the option to code that in the first 3 days. And then you'll see for that second column, the 14-day period, there's several items that are grayed out. We're not going to be looking at those for that specific time period. IV access, it's not just, it's adding that additional, okay, they're getting an IV medication, or maybe they just have IV access. What kind is it? Is it a midline? Is it central? Those are all things that you have to have. And again, you can't just check these because you went in and looked at the resident and you know that they're there, so you're going to come back and code it. You've got to document. Documentation has to be in place in order for us to code this. So where is it documented? Is it in the nurse's note? Is it in the physician's orders? In that time period, it has to be documented. They did remove these 2 items, so 0600 and 0700. These for a while now have not been required in every state. But they have remained on the item set. So CMS has now removed them completely from the item set, and that's your physician examination and physician orders.
All right, we're going to take a look at some changes in section Q. All right, so in section Q, under participation in assessment and goal setting, we've got the old Q0100 A, B, and C items combined into one. And we also have a change in the answer options. Now it's a check all that apply. So this should absolutely be from the resident's perspective if they're able to express it. All right, so residents' overall goal at item Q0310, which is the old Q0300, there was a couple of formatting, what am I trying to say? No, I tried to say it too many times and I can't. They reformatted the question. Let's just put it like that. The item was renamed from residents' overall expectation to residents' overall goal. And the answer options were also reworded to remove expects to or expects to be. All right, at item Q0490, we see a retitle that details the resident's documented preference to avoid being asked question Q0500B. And the word documented wasn't present in the title before. So really want to put an emphasis on the fact that this really needs to be backed up by source documentation in the resident's medical record. All right, at Q0500, we see a new question asking about source documentation. After asking the patient, do you want to talk to someone about the possibility of leaving this facility and returning to live and receive services in the community? We'll need to document and code the information source used to answer that question. And those options are the resident, family, significant other, legal guardian, other legally authorized representative, or none of the above. So another piece of source documentation that we'll need in the patient's record. All right, at item Q0620, it was broken up with the addition of at Q0610, we have another item at Q0620 to expand on that original question. So if the answer to item Q0610 is no, we now need to indicate the reason why a referral to that local contact agency was not made, and that was not there before. All right, we also have our references here. Amy, we will turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Megan. And thank you everybody for joining us today. I also want to thank Stacy and Megan, the combo, for their outstanding presentation and all of the valuable insights that you shared with us. I do want to remind everyone that the recording of this webinar will be available for viewing on our website on our resource page, but we'll also be sharing that link with you so you can share with your team or revisit the webinar at your convenience. As Stacy mentioned earlier in the presentation, we do have quite the lineup of webinars next month. These are all listed on our event page of our website, which is qrmhealth.com/events. Two of our webinars on August 16th and 17th will focus on the crucial topics of IDT collaboration and team roles. I encourage you to share these upcoming events with your respective teams, as they will provide valuable insights and strategies that will enhance your teamwork and documentation gathering. And then the session on August 22nd is dedicated to leadership training. This will offer practical guidance and strategies to optimize your team's CMS success. So we have a lot planned for you. We're very excited, and you can view more information on these sessions and registration details, of course, at qrmhealth.com/events. On our next slide, we quickly highlight some of the key services that QRM offers. So of course, we have MDS oversight services led by Mark and our lovely host today, Stacy and Megan. Additionally, on our next slide, we have everything, as you probably know, from in-house rehab management, multi-claim contractor audits, as well as long-term care, branding, and marketing support. So if you are interested in learning more about any of these services or would like to explore how we can assist your facility specifically, please do not hesitate to reach out to the team. So once again, I just want to thank you all for joining us today. We have our contact information here, and we hope to see you on the upcoming webinars in August. Have a great day. Bye-bye.